Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, we are diving deep into one of the most essential concepts in JavaScript, and that is scope and hosting. Whether you are a beginner or someone who is brushing up on the core fundamentals, understanding that how the JavaScript handle variable access and memory allocation, it is very critical to writing for clean and bug-free code. In this video, I will explain three main types of scope. Number one, global scope, then function scope, and after it, I will explain block scope. And we will also understand that where our variable lives and how we can access them. After it, we will move on to the hosting. Hosting is a very unique behavior in JavaScript where the variables and the functions they are moved to the top of their scope during the compilation phase. If you have ever seen a reference error or you wonder that why a variable is undefined before its declaration, at that point hosting is the key to understand that why and how. So stick around because mastering these two topics will give you a strong foundation for advanced JavaScript concept. So let's get started. So let's start from the global scope. Global scope is the most outer level of scope in the JavaScript. Any variable or any function that is declared outside of a function or a block, it becomes the part of the global scope, and we can access it from anywhere in our code. So it means that whether we are working in a function or we are working in a loop or any conditional statement or we are in any block scope, we can still refer to the global variables and the functions. So let's see an example that how we can declare a global variable. So here, first of all, I create a variable and I name it as global var, and inside I write it that I am global. So now this variable can become the part of the global scope and we can access it from anywhere in our code. Either we are working at the global scope or we are working inside a function or we are working inside a block. So if I try to access it here and I write console.log and I write global var. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, I will get the value of the global var. So I run the file node scope.js. So you see, I get the value. I am global. I get the value of the variable. So now I create a function and I name the function get value. I create a simple function and now I try to access the value of the global variable inside the function. So I move it here. So in this case, I declare the variable global var at the global scope, but I am trying to access the value of this variable in the inside a function. So now if I run the file, so nothing is printed. Why? Okay, because we didn't call the function. Okay, so my bad. So what is happening here? I declare the function, I write the console.log inside the function, but I did not call the function. Okay, so if I want that logic inside the function will be executed, I need to call the function. So here I call function get value. So here. So now if I save the file, now you can see that I will get the console.log. So now if I run the file, so you see, I am getting the value, I am global. I declare the variable at global scope, but I can access the value inside a function. So here is the thing. The thing is that when we are using too many global variables, it can create the namespace pollution. Namespace pollution where different parts of our code might accidentally overwrite each other's variable. For example, when we are working at the large scale project, so at that point, there are a lot of variables. We need to create a lot of variables. So these variables can override each other's value. So at that point, it becomes a very serious issue. And for solving that issue, we have block scope and the function scope. So now let's see what is the function scope. In JavaScript, function scope means that any variable that is declared inside a function using var, let, or const keyword, it is accessible only within that function, not outside of the function. Let's take an example that I create a function and simple function and function name is get value. Inside the function, I create a variable message and the message is that hello from inside function. So now I create a variable within this function. So now I try to access the value of this variable inside the function. So if I write here message, I need to call this function to get the value on the console. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, you will see that the message will be printed. If I run the file using node scope.js, So you see, I get the value hello from inside the function. Okay. So I can access the value of the variable inside the function. But what if I try to access this value outside of the function? So if I cut it and move it here, so now in this case, if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see there is an error. What is error? There is a reference error, message is not defined. Okay, scope.js line number 78. So at the line number 78, we are trying to access the value of the message variable, but the variable is inside the function. So we cannot access the value of this variable outside of the function. So this is the example of the function scope. This type of scope helps us to write the modular and reusable code. Each function creates a private space for its own variables, so we don't have to worry about accidentally overwriting or being affected by the variables in each function or the global scope. So let's take another example that we can understand the function scope in a very deep level. So if I write here function and I name the function that calculate area, I create a simple function. So inside the function parameter, I am taking two parameters. The first is length and the second is width. So I declare a function calculate area and I'm receiving two parameter. First is length and the second is width. So inside the function, I create a variable and its name is area. Now I can multiply the length and the width and I can get the area. So I write here length and multiplication operator and width. So now and below, if I console.log and I write the area, after it I call the function and calculate area. Inside parameters, the first parameter is length, so I write 12 and the second parameter is width, I can write as 6. Okay. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see we get the area. We get the area. So if I write here, I can use backticks. I write here area is and dollar sign curly braces. So here I can write the area variable. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see area is 72. So now if I change these values, the area will be changed. For example, if I write here 24 and the width is 12. So now if I save the file and run the file, so you see area is 288, which is the multiplication of 24 into 12. So now the length and the width parameter and the area variable, now the length and the width parameter and the area variable, these are having the function scope. These are available only within this function. If you try to access these three outside of the function, we will get an error. For example, if I write here console.log and if I try to access the value of area, now you see that I am trying to access the value of area variable outside of the function. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, I will see an error. If I run the file, so you see we are getting an error. What is the error? Area is not defined. Line number 88. At the line number 88, we are trying to access the value of area, but it is saying that area is not defined. Why? Because area is defined inside the function. Area is only available within that function. It cannot be available outside of the function. Similarly, if I try to access length, again I will get an error. So you see, now length is not defined. Same, length is not defined. Similarly for width. So now the variables that are declared in the function or any parameter in the function, these are only available within that function. Now let's talk about the block scope. So block scope is introduced in ES6. It is introduced in with the let and the const keyword. A block scope in JavaScript is anything that is wrapped inside the curly braces. Okay. So whatever we are wrapped inside the curly braces, so it will make a block. For example, that we are using the if statement or we are using the for loop or even a standalone curly braces, it is also considered as a block. So the variables that are declared using let and const keyword inside the blocks, they are only accessible within that block and we cannot access them outside of that block. So let's see how it works. So let's see an example by using the if block. So let's create a variable and the variable name is value and I am giving the value true. Now I will use if block. So if value is equal to true, then so here inside the curly braces, inside the block, I create a variable and let message is equal to block scope variable. So now if I try to access the variable, this variable inside this block, it is available. I can access. But if I try to access this variable outside of the block, I cannot. Okay, so let's see it. First I write here console.log and I write message. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see, I can get the value of variable, block scope variable. I can access the value of the variable. But what if I try to access the value of this variable outside of the block? So if I move it here, outside of the block, so now if I save the file, now I will get an error. So if I run the file, so you see error. What is the error? Message is not defined, 131. So at the line number 131, I am trying to access the value of message variable, but the variable is declared inside the block. Okay, so this is how block scope works. It is not any function, it is just a simple if block. So whenever we are working inside the if block and we create the variable using the let and const keyword, we cannot access them outside of the block. For example, if I change this here const, so now I change the keyword and instead of let I write here const. So it will again work the same. Again I will get an error. If I run the file again error. Message is not defined. Same error we get here. But what if I create this variable using var keyword? So now if I am using var keyword, now I am using var keyword. Instead of let and const, I am using the var keyword. So in this case, I can access the value of the variable. So if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see, I can access the value of the variable. So now what is happening? I'm using var keyword and I can access the value of the this variable outside of this block. This is a major drawback for the var keyword, that we can access the value of the variable of the var keyword outside of the blocks. So now let's see that how block scope works whenever we are working with the nested if blocks. So let's create another variable here and let age is equal to 25. And again I am writing an if block that if age is greater than 18, then execute this block. And here again I create a variable and here I create a variable that nested variable and its value is I am nested variable. So now if I try to access the value of this nested variable inside the nested if block, I can get the value of the variable. But if I move outside of the block, I cannot get the value of the variable. So if I write here console.log and nested var, so if I save the file, I can get the value of the nested variable. So if I run the file, so you see, I am nested variable. I can get the value of this variable. But what if I move outside of the nested block? So instead of the nested if block, I am moving this within this block, which is the outer if block. So if I paste it here, so now I will get an error. If I save the file and if I run the file, so you see, I am getting an error. What is error? Nested var is not defined. Line number 136. So now at the line number 136, I am trying to access the value of nested variable, but this nested variable is declared inside this nested if block. So that's how block scope work. Whatever the variable using let and const keyword we created in any block, those variable cannot move outside of those block. This is one of the key reasons that why modern JavaScript developers prefer let and const over the var keyword. They provide better control over variable visibility. They help prevent accidental reassignment and the leaks. They can make our code more predictable and safer, especially when we are working with the loops and when we are working with the if statements and the nested if blocks. So in these cases, we prefer the const and the let keyword. Now let's talk about the hosting in the JavaScript. In JavaScript, hosting is the process where variables and functions they are moved to the top of their scope before the code executes. For example, we declare the function or we declare a variable, so we can access the function and the variable before their declarations. But remember, The only declarations are hosted, not the actual values or the assignments are hosted. So let's see how hosting works in JavaScript. So let's create a variable that where age is equal to 24. And now if I try to access this variable after its declaration, I can get the value of the variable. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see I can get the value of age. Okay. But what if I try to access this variable before its declaration? I try to access value of the variable age before its declaration. I declare later, but I try to access the value before. So in this case, what will happen? So if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see, we are getting undefined. We did not see an error. We are just getting undefined. It means that variable will be hosted before its declaration. But it's not the same thing while we're using the let and the const keyword. When we are using let and const keyword, in that case, we see an error. For example, if I use let keyword, so now I will see an error. And if I run the file, so you see, now I am seeing an error. Cannot access age before initialization. It is saying that I cannot access the value of the age variable before its declaration. In the case of variables, the let and the const keyword did not allow us to access the variable before its declaration. So now let's move on to the function. So how function will be hosted? If I create a function here and function name is getValue, I simple console.log and I write here that I am getValue function. Now, in the case of function, if I try to access the function before its declaration, so if I write here get value, now I can access it. If I run the file, so I can get the value of the function. I can access the function before after its declaration. But what if I try to run the function before its declaration? So if I move it here, so now I am calling function before its declaration. So in this case, if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see, again, I am getting the value of the function. Why? Because function will be hosted before its declaration. Before its declaration, function will be hosted. But we study that we can declare the function with three types, and one is the function declaration, other is the function expression, and the third one is the arrow function. But when we are working with a function expression, for example, if I create a function without name and if I create a simple function and I write here function expression, and now I assign this function to a variable, and now I create a function expression by using the second method, which is function expression. So now if I try to access this function expression and I write here function expression, I am calling this function expression after its declaration. So in this case, if I save the file and if I run the file, so you see, I can access the function expression printed. I can access the function after its declaration. But what if I try to access this function before its declaration? So if I move it here, now in this case, I will see an error. So now if I save the file and if I run the file, so now I am getting an error. What error? Cannot access function expression before initialization. So now in this case, I cannot access this function before its declaration. But we see that it is not the same case with the function declaration or with the arrow function. For example, if I see here that in this case, here I can access the function getValue before its declaration. But when we are working with the function expression, in this case, we cannot get the access the value. That's all for this video about scope and hosting in JavaScript. We have covered that how variables behave in global scope, how they behave in function scope, and how they behave in the block scope. We also explored the concept of hosting, where JavaScript lifts the variable and function declaration during its execution phase. Understanding these fundamentals is very crucial because they affect how your code runs, how variables are accessed, and how the errors can creep in if you are not careful. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more coding content like this. Drop a comment below if you have any question or if you would like to explain any other concept in detail. I've got more exciting JavaScript concepts, so stay tuned and keep coding smart. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep coding and keep growing.